The photographer who took this picture recorded a silence that was savage beyond belief. Her name was Alice Seeley Harris, British missionary who had traveled to the Congo at the turn of the 20th century, armed with a camera and a certainty that the world, once shown the truth, would demand that it stop. She was wrong about how quickly it would stop, but she was right about the power of the image. The man in the frame is Nasala. He is seated on a veranda. He isn't looking at a trophy of war. He isn't looking at the camera. He is looking at the severed hand and foot of his 5-year-old daughter, the tax he had to pay because he failed to harvest enough rubber that day. Her name was Boali. She was 5 years old. The soldiers had also killed his wife. He had walked for several hours carrying what remained of his family to show the missionaries what had been done. That photograph was taken in 1904. It would become one of the most important documents in the history of human rights. But for Nsala, in that moment, it was simply the evidence of a debt the world owed him, that it would never fully pay. This wasn't the work of a lawless bandit operating in some ungoverned wilderness. It was the calculating machinery of a man the world called a great philanthropist, a man who was received in royal courts, who corresponded with presidents, who commissioned monuments and funded museums, and gave speeches about the sacred duty of civilization to uplift the suffering peoples of the earth. His name was Leopold II, King of the Belgians, and he was, by any credible measure, one of the most efficient architects of human suffering in recorded history. We often think of history as a series of dates and battles, the clean lines of a textbook, the confident captions beneath portrait paintings of men in uniform. But the story of Leopold II resists that kind of order. It is something more primal than a chapter of political history. It is a study of how a human being can maintain total, undisputed power over the physical world by wearing a mask of divine favor and humanitarian truth, and how the world, because it wanted to believe in that mask, helped him keep it on. In the next 20 minutes, we are stripping away the sanitized legends of the 19th century. You are going to discover how one man turned a territory 76 times the size of his own country into a private battlefield of survival, a place where human beings were catalogued, rationed, and destroyed with the same indifference a factory owner applies to a broken machine. You are going to discover how he killed, by the most conservative scholarly estimates, 10 million people, proportionally more than many of the 20th century's worst dictators, and died celebrated, wealthy, and largely unpunished. And you are going to understand why that was possible. Because the answer has not expired with the 19th century. The machinery Leopold built, the machinery of noble language wrapped around profitable violence, is still running. We just don't always recognize it when we see it. Leopold II didn't invade the Congo with an army. He invaded it with a legal trap. And to understand how he set that trap, you have to understand what the world looked like in 1884, a year when the great powers of Europe were gathered in Berlin to divide an entire continent between themselves, as calmly as men dividing an inheritance. The Berlin Conference was not a meeting of conquerors admitting to conquest. It was a meeting of diplomats performing the theater of civilization. The official purpose was to regulate the so-called humanitarian division of Africa, to prevent conflict between the European powers, and, in the language that was used without irony, to bring the benefits of trade and Christian mission to the native peoples of the continent. No African delegate was present. No African voice was consulted. The continent was parceled out over a table in a room where its people did not exist. Leopold understood this theater perfectly. He was, in many ways, its most gifted performer. He arrived at Berlin not as a colonial power seeking territory. Belgium had no imperial tradition, no navy to speak of, no history of overseas conquest. He arrived as something far more useful, a neutral, a philanthropist, a man who wanted nothing for himself, only for the suffering people of Central Africa. He spoke of ending the Arab slave trade. He spoke of building roads and schools and trading posts. He named his enterprise the International Association of the Congo, a title designed to imply a consortium of enlightened nations rather than the private holding company of one ambitious king. Think about the audacity. He didn't ask for a colony for Belgium. He asked for it for himself. The great powers of Europe, each one suspicious of the others, each one relieved to have a neutral custodian standing between them and the richest land in Central Africa, gave it to him. The Congo Free State, and notice the word free, placed there deliberately, like a signature on a forgery, became the only colony in recorded history owned entirely by one man, not a nation, not a company. One man, an area of roughly 900,000 square miles, larger than Western Europe, containing somewhere between 20 and 30 million people, was handed to Leopold II as personal property. He was the master of everything under heaven. But to the world's press, to the diplomatic community, to the readers of polite European newspapers, he was just a humble servant of God's will. Once the mask of philanthropy was secured and the paperwork of civilization had been filed in the appropriate capitals, the unsanitized reality emerged. Not gradually, immediately. The world had developed, in the 1880s and 1890s, a sudden and insatiable hunger for rubber. The pneumatic tire had been invented, the bicycle was everywhere, the automobile was arriving, and rubber, the kind that could only be harvested by hand deep in equatorial forest, from wild vines bleeding their sap into collection cups, was worth almost as much as gold. Leopold had tens of millions of acres of it. He created the Force Publique, a private army of approximately 19,000 soldiers, commanded largely by European officers and staffed by forcibly conscripted Congolese men. This was not a police force maintaining order. It was a machine designed to extract. Every village in the Congo Free State was assigned a rubber quota, a fixed quantity that had to be delivered, on schedule, regardless of weather, illness, distance, or the physical limits of the human body. And here is where the system achieves its most clinical horror. The Force Publique soldiers were issued a precise number of bullets for each operation. They were required to account for every bullet fired, and the accounting required proof. That proof was a severed human hand. One bullet, one hand. If a soldier fired his weapon and missed, or fired it for any reason not sanctioned by the quota system, he was expected to bring back a hand anyway, to prove he hadn't wasted the ammunition. This created a grotesque internal logic. Hands became currency. Baskets of hands were submitted to company officials as itemized receipts. Soldiers began cutting hands from the living as well as the dead to ensure their numbers balanced. Imagine what this did to a village. Not the abstract horror of it, but the specific daily texture of it. Community that had lived in those forests for generations, that had its own songs, its own trade networks, its own seasonal calendar, now organized its entire existence around a rubber quota. Men spent days and sometimes weeks deep in the forest, bleeding the wild vines in the canopy above. Women and children were frequently taken hostage to ensure the men returned. When the quota wasn't met, and it often wasn't because the quotas were set not by what was possible but by what Leopold's accountants required, the soldiers came. When the soldiers left, what remained was a village that had to explain to itself what it had just survived and prepare to survive it again. This wasn't mindless madness. Distinction matters. Mindless violence is chaotic and eventually self-destructive. What Leopold built was rational violence, violence in service of a spreadsheet. Just as Vlad the Impaler used a forest of the dead to psychologically break his enemies before a battle had even begun, Leopold used a basket of hands to ensure that terror remained a reliable management tool, and that his dividends remained high. The difference is that Vlad the Impaler is remembered as a monster. Leopold II has a train station named after him in Brussels. How did he get away with it for 23 years? How does a man run an open-air operation of this scale and continue to receive favorable coverage in the international press? He possessed a weapon more dangerous than any gun his Force Publique carried: the ability to control the narrative. and he wielded it with a sophistication that would be recognizable to any modern public relations strategist. While the Congo was a wasteland of ash and silence, while villages were burned and populations collapsed and the forests that had sustained human life for millennia were going quiet, Leopold was building monuments in Brussels. He commissioned grand boulevards, triumphal arches, public parks, and botanical gardens. He funded the Royal Museum for Central Africa, which opened in 1904, and presented the Congo not as a crime scene, but as a civilizational project. Dioramas of native life, artifacts of a culture his agents were simultaneously destroying, displayed in the language of anthropological curiosity rather than colonial guilt. The museum presented Leopold as a steward, the Congo as a beneficiary. In 1897, he went further. At the International Exposition in Brussels, Leopold created what the press called a human zoo. He brought 267 Congolese men, women, and children to Belgium and placed them in a simulated village on the exposition grounds. Constructed environment of thatched huts and tropical plants, designed to represent African life for the edification and amusement of white European spectators. Visitors paid to observe them. Newspapers described them with a mixture of scientific curiosity and open condescension. The Congolese people in that enclosure were written about as specimens of the savage world that Leopold was in the process of saving. 7 of the 267 people brought to Belgium for the exposition died there, far from their homes and families, in a country that regarded them as exhibits. Their names were recorded, if at all, as entries in a medical log. Leopold held press conferences, he gave interviews, he published pamphlets, he funded a network of journalists and academics whose job, whether they fully understood it or not, was to launder his reputation. When critics raised questions about conditions in the Congo, he commissioned counter-reports. He called his accusers jealous rivals and enemies of progress. He asked, with apparent sincerity, how anyone could question the motives of a man who had devoted his personal fortune to the civilization of a continent. Why do we applaud the great builder of Belgium while ignoring the screaming forests he left behind? Because he understood something fundamental about how human beings receive information. Perception is not merely stronger than an army. Perception is the army. If you can win the war of how things are described, you never have to win the war on the ground. The machinery of the throne eventually encountered a variable Leopold had not fully accounted for. Not a rival king, not a foreign army, not a diplomatic crisis or a military defeat. A shipping clerk. His name was Edmund Dane Morel, known as E.D. Morel, and in the late 1890s, he was working for a Liverpool shipping company called Elder Dempster, which handled the cargo traffic between Belgium and the Congo. Morel was not a journalist or an activist. He was an administrator, man who understood shipping, manifests the way a musician understands a score, fluently, instinctively, able to hear when something was wrong. And something was profoundly wrong. Ships were leaving Belgium loaded with weapons, ammunition, and military supplies. Ships were returning from the Congo loaded with rubber and ivory. But there was nothing flowing in the other direction. No trade goods, no payment, no commercial exchange of any kind that would indicate a legitimate economy. Morel understood immediately what this meant. The rubber and ivory weren't being purchased. They were being seized. The people of the Congo weren't trading with Leopold's agents. They were being forced to deliver their labor and the resources of their land at gunpoint, with no compensation whatsoever. What Leopold had described to the world as commerce was, in the only language that balance sheets speak, slavery. He realized the philanthropic mask wasn't just a lie. It was a lie that had been sewn into the official record. The paperwork of civilization was on close examination, a confession. Morel quit his job and began one of the earliest and most consequential human rights campaigns in modern history. He founded the Congo Reform Association. He wrote books, he gave speeches, He collected testimony from missionaries, traders, and survivors who had watched what Leopold's system did to living human beings, and he refused to let that testimony stay buried in consular archives. He found a partner in Roger Casement, a British diplomat who had been sent to the Congo on an official investigation and returned shattered. Casement had interviewed survivors. He had catalogued mutilations. He had sat with men like Ensala and listened to what they had to carry. And he had written it all down in a consular report that the British Foreign Office received in 1903 and could not, despite every institutional instinct toward discretion, ignore. The world saw the photographs, Alice Harris's photographs, the blood-soaked visual proof that turned the abstract language of human rights into something you couldn't look away from and couldn't explain as exaggeration or colonial rivalry or the invention of jealous enemies. The divine favor Leopold had claimed for 20 years was revealed, in the plain light of documentary evidence, to be evil so pure and so bureaucratically organized that it defies the comfortable categories we normally use to make sense of human cruelty. In 1908, under sustained international pressure, the Belgian parliament voted to strip Leopold of the Congo Free State and transfer it to the Belgian government. Leopold accepted the transfer only after negotiating a financial settlement, a payment, effectively, for the territory he had already bled for decades. He received compensation. The 10 million dead received nothing. The people of the Congo received a new colonial master who would continue to exploit the land and its inhabitants for another half-century, under different management, and with a somewhat cleaner public image. Leopold II died in 1909, a man of immense personal wealth, surrounded by his mistress, described in the Belgian press with a mixture of mourning and complicated reverence. He was 84 years old. He had never stood trial. He had never been required to account in any formal or legal sense for what had been done under his authority and in his name. He had, in the final accounting, gotten away with it. But the real horror of Leopold's story isn't just the 10 million ghosts. Monstrous as that number is, and it should stop you, every time you encounter it, the way a physical blow stops you, the number is almost too large to absorb. The mind reaches for it and retreats. What is harder to absorb, and more important to sit with, is the mechanism. Because the mechanism persists. We still talk about the golden age of empire in the language Leopold helped construct, the language of civilization brought to darkness, of order imposed on chaos, of development as a gift that colonial powers bestowed rather than a theft they committed. We still build museums that display the artifacts of cultures whose destruction funded the museum's construction. We still name things after the architects of these systems, streets, stations, institutions, and call it history rather than complicity. Leopold's story is not a cautionary tale about one unusually cruel king. It is a demonstration of what happens when the structures that are supposed to check power, journalism, diplomacy, international law, public opinion, are systematically captured by the person that power belongs to. Leopold didn't just exploit the Congo, he exploited the language in which the Congo was discussed. He made humanitarianism into a camouflage pattern. He turned missionary work into cover. He transformed a basket of severed hands into a line item, and a line item into a profit report, and a profit report into the funding for a museum that told the story of his own greatness. He showed us something we have not yet fully learned, that the worst horrors in history don't arrive wearing the face of evil. They arrive wearing the face of improvement. They arrive with a development plan and a press release and an invitation to the exposition. They arrive promising to civilize the savage, to bring light to the dark places of the earth, to elevate the primitive and free the enslaved. And by the time the language has been decoded, by the time the manifests have been read correctly, the hands have already been cut. King Leopold II was a man who built a throne of rubber and called it progress. He was a psychological architect of the First Order, a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone of his era, that a mask does not merely conceal the truth. Maintained with enough conviction, funded with enough money and defended with enough institutional force. A mask replaces it. In the public imagination, in the official record, in the monuments and museums and boulevards he left behind in Brussels, he was the great builder of Belgium, the philanthropist king, the man who brought civilization to Central Africa, until the evidence became impossible to ignore, until the photographs arrived, until the shipping manifests were read correctly, until a clerk and a diplomat and a missionary with a camera refused, at significant personal cost, to let the mask stay on. His story is the unsanitized reality of what happens when we choose profit over life, and then choose, for 23 years, to describe that choice as charity. The history we think we know is often just a mask for a much darker, more human reality. If this investigation into the red rubber of the Congo gave you a new perspective on the machinery of power, on how language becomes a weapon and philanthropy becomes an alibi, then let this be the beginning of a longer inquiry, not the end of one. Hit the subscribe button, because next, you need to watch the story of the real Tamerlane, another architect of the macabre who built his empire on bone and called his methods divine will. The patterns are different. The mechanism is the same. I'll see you in the next investigation.